Well, everyone, good to see you coming in, and welcome to CG seminar stroke webinar number 197. We approach the 200th webinar, which is going to be about media coverage of higher education and research, and we expect will attract a lot of interest with a panel of journalists spruiking for all of us on how they see the situation of universities from a public interest point of view. Today, though, we're on what's Spanish for development, Chilean higher education at an impasse. So Chile, we go back to Chile, and it's a country which attracts a lot of interest around the world for, I think, various historical reasons, and also because it sits on something of an intercultural fault line between Europe, the Anglophone countries, and Latin America, the Spanish-speaking countries, and it's very well connected internationally. As a former Australian, I'm always really glad to see the Southern Hemisphere up there as well. Today, we've got three really good speakers on Chile, but before I introduce them to you, can I take you through the webinar protocols? Now, remember that the webinar is being recorded, so everything you say will be forever out there on record, and we'll post the online version on the CG website within 48 hours, and you, of course, reach it on YouTube. And our webinars get as much attention on YouTube as that, or more than they get through direct audience. Transcript of the chat function will also be posted. So what you say in the chat to everybody will appear in the permanent record as well. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or ask a question. And you don't have to have a video on during the webinar, but please turn it on and turn on your sound when you're asking a question. We recommend that you use speaker view in Zoom settings so you can more clearly see who is speaking at any given time. To ask a question, and we really recommend that you do this, post your question first in the chat. We'll select the Q&A from what's coming in the chat, so that on the basis of relevancy, but also on the basis of early posting, because questions that come in towards the end, and often good questions do, tend to miss out because we usually have composed a speaking list by then. So a good time would be while Elisabeth, our last speaker, is speaking, have your question coming forward around about that time and just after that, as the Q&A begins, and then you'll be most likely to be part of this discussion. When you're invited to ask your question, please unmute yourself. Most important, I usually forget it about once every webinar myself. Switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. So now it's a pleasure to introduce our speakers today, because I know them and I've worked with them over the years, and they're good colleagues. José Salazar was the vice rector academic, the provost in effect, at Chile's State University of Valparaíso, and I visited him on campus last time I was in Chile. And he now works with the Interinstitutional Institute for Education Research and a student experience study group. José served on Chile's Comisión de Expertos para la Regulación de Aranceles. You'll have to tell us what that means, José. Which advised on fee policies and publicly funded higher education. So he's been a policymaker. He knows the policy sphere and quality assurance and those sorts of areas. So you get some extent, you get the gamekeeper here as well as the poacher. Now Pete Leihy maybe is just a poacher. I think he's a scholar, and he's a very erudite and sharp-minded one, and we've appreciated his contributions over the years on Chile and on higher education in general. He uses history and he uses philosophy in his work. Currently, I'm not sure where you're working, Pete. You did your postdoc at the Catholic University, and you finished in 2020. You can tell us where you are now. And you were originally from Melbourne, which is where, of course, I met you, because I had the good fortune of supervising your doctoral work. Now, to keep these two rascals honest, we have Elisabeth Simbürger, which is great. Elisabeth has a PhD in sociology from Warwick, long experience of Chilean higher education, and she's at Valparaíso, a full professor in the Department of sociology, and we look forward to her contribution as well. Our speakers are going to pass the baton between them, and at this point, it's a great pleasure to hand over to José.
Thank you so much, Simon. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Not yet? And now?
There it comes. Yes, got it.
Great. And thanks for the invitation and your kind words, Simon. In the next few minutes, I will provide you with a background on Chilean higher education, on which Pete will elaborate later and Elisabeth will comment on. An initial warning though. Departing from most local analysis, in this presentation, I will be covering the university sector, excluding technical and vocational tertiary education with few exceptions. Two reasons for this. First, I want to provide a picture of the sector that is easy to compare with other national systems of higher education. And second, university and vocational education in Chile are fairly separated from one another. So credit recognition for transferring from vocational to undergrad courses are kind of rare nationwide. This presentation covers three broad themes. First, I will look briefly at the comparative context of Chilean higher education. Later, I will show you the remarkable transformation it has experienced over the last few decades. And finally, I will discuss the policy evolution for the sector from an aggregate viewpoint, to close providing you with a brief summary of its main policy challenges. I would love to skip all of this, but the study of Chilean higher education is a convoluted, multi-layered affair, one that most external assessments fail to grasp in its complexity. So, context first. Using data from Education at Glance 2020, it seems that participation in Chilean higher education is very close to OECD average, as you can see on the chart. In fact, it seems in a better shape than most middle-income nations. But when you look at the specifics, some remarkable features start to appear. The figure at the top left indicates that Chile invests a significant percentage of its GDP in education, while the picture at the bottom left eloquently suggests that Chile is the OECD nation that invests the largest part of its resources in higher education. Most resources, 1.7% of GDP in particular, are coming from the families. Yet, as the figure on the left demonstrates, public investment in Chilean higher education will expand significantly between 2012 and 2017. No other nation has shown such largesse, only Brazil come close. So it is fair to say that investing in higher education is worthwhile in the current Chilean mindset. The current situation helps explain why, and it is shown on the figure on the left. Compare in PPT dollars, tuition fees in Chilean universities are only below the US and the UK. And this applies to all types of providers, as the figure on the left illustrates. State subsidized and private universities show a small difference in tuition fees charged. But are Chileans just fools? The figure on the left suggests that the net private returns for primary and secondary education are fairly low in Chile, in PPT dollars, of course. However, the same chart suggests that financial gains of higher education are only bigger in the US and Luxembourg, and especially for men. Is it a problem of credentials? The chart on the right suggests that the answer is no. It depicts the percentage of Chilean adults that reach PIAC level 2 for 2015. This is functional literacy, the ability to read and understand short, straightforward pieces of text. This increases greatly having had higher education. This level of literacy is still low, but you can see a shortening of the skill gap with OECD average to just 20%, compared to the 45% and 38% gaps exhibited in primary and secondary education. So quickly, let's review the key features of the evolution of Chilean higher education in relation to enrollment and funding. Participation has grown steadily over the last 30 years. Gross participation is currently at 55%. Yet net participation has increased slower than gross participation over the period. The former has expanded 3 times compared to the almost 4 times expansion of gross participation, suggesting that much of the expansion has been fueled by working adults seeking higher education salary premiums and credentials for career they're already in. The current level of participation, aligned with an ongoing economic crisis, indicate that there is little room for further expansion among working adults. Taking a very long perspective, from 1935 to 2020, enrollments have expanded, but not in an incremental fashion. In fact, the chart depicts 2 expansive waves, between 1965 and 1975, and from 1995 to 2020. In between, enrollments constructed between 1975 and 1990. And the current expansion wave seems to be reaching its end. The rate of growth has been decreasing sharply since 2010, as the red line shows. Although not shown in the chart, the last figure represents a decrease of about 20,000 university students between 2019 and 2020. Most of the expansion has been channeled through the private absorbing private supervision. In just 1 decade, from 1995 to 2005, this new private sector grew 10 times to double again in the next 5 years. Its prominence, however, has been declining in recent times as the traditional sector keeps growing. Recently, 3 private universities joined the traditional Council of Rectors, which helped explain recent variation in trends. Today, there are 59 universities in Chile, 30 in the Council of Rectors, and another 29 private. It's interesting to note that since 1997, no private university has been successfully created in the country. Funding has also experienced significant variations over time. Regardless of this massive recent expansion, the public contribution to higher education has not matched the levels of the 1970s, measured as a percentage of GDP. Yet, since 2005, there is a continuous and substantive increase of state support for the sector. The largest share of the current trend is clearly allocated to student support, in orange in the chart. But because policy has enshrined a mixed public provision principle, these monies went to traditional and private universities in similar proportions, even though a few of the latter are de facto for profit. In contrast, most block grants and research and development funding are allocated to traditional institutions, which overall exhibit the greater scientific productivity. One concerning trend in the sector is the sudden concentration of state support on the demand side of higher education. It implies that the vast majority of state funding depends on expanding or keeping enrollment levels. With this gig economy approach, it is quite hard to plan for the long-term development for Chilean universities. Since enrollment figures have been decreasing in recent years, universities have started to feel the pain. Their efficiency problems are also popping up, yet many lack the resources to properly address them. The so far mean-tested free higher education regime, or Gratuidad, is the new kid on the block. It started as a pilot in 2016, it is complicated and really difficult to implement. Yet it currently concentrates close to 30% of all state support for higher education. And this figure does not account for Gratuidad at the vocational tertiary sector, which is also massive. Furthermore, 26 universities are not yet included in this funding scheme. So the current situation raises many questions. Is this regime sustainable in the long run? Is it just a mere substitution of private funding? Has it caused efficiency and sustainable questions in some universities because it's causing somehow deficits? Is it targeting the right students? Regarding all these issues, is it highly popular, of course? So there's very little political appetite for advocated reform at the moment. So let's briefly shift to the Chilean policy evolution for higher education. I won't explain all the features included in this slide because Pete would devote some time to do so. Basically, there are identifiable phases of reform reflecting the political and economic climate of the nation. Phase 4, from 1998, is of crucial importance, and I just have completed a study of Mesesub institutional improvement initiatives with Mauricio Rifo. It is a time when Chile adopts the World Bank recipe for higher education expansion and modernization, including accreditation, performance-based funding, and a new student loan scheme. Its consequences are still very alive. Yet the discontent that freewheeling and poorly regulated expansion caused among students and families prompted the comprehensive reform of 2018, which brought us gratuidad. The new framework is currently under implementation, and it has experienced vast problems. Little is known of its direction, theory of action, and long-term goals. But what we can say about this evolution over time? A few things. Chilean higher education policy has not been incremental. There are abrupt changes of course of action, expansion from 1967 and from mid-1990s until recently, for example, and important policy vacuums, such as the early years of the military government in the 1970s and the current morass. These features prompt us to think that higher education policy exhibit a pendular fashion in Chile, making difficult for considering the long-term development of universities. However, there is significant overlap of policy and regulation, with noteworthy continuities and discontinuities coming from policy sedimentation. All of these cause unexpected policy effects, of course, such as the corruption of accreditation and the growing state support for for-profit providers. Of course, economic development and democratization are not incompatible, but Chilean universities seem to be getting some trouble accommodating different aims as well, because there is something about the Chilean culture that's influencing that outcome somehow. But our biggest challenge, however, is providing the sector with a clear direction that fosters cooperation and coordination. And of course, a new policy narrative is urgently needed. But I will stop here. Pete, now the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm sharing screen. This is the hardest part, of course. We now have to we are sharing the screen and we are playing the slideshow.
The screen is there.
Excellent. That's what I want.
We now have the full screen, so there you are.
I'm very happy. Well, I'm now going to deepen the story very briskly of Chilean higher education policy under development, that is higher education as part of a development mindset. The Chilean development mindset can be traced back as far as you like, really. It's especially important to note that economically focused development considerations were very prominent in the middle of last century, particularly with respect to attempts at government attentive to the people's needs and approved aspirations. Here we can focus on the last 40 years, not least because Chile is currently in the process of formulating the replacement of the constitution imposed in 1980 in the middle of a 16.5-year military government. In 1981, halfway through military rule, with the economy surging, there was a major higher education reform introducing student fees and the conversion of many state university satellite campuses into closely supervised universities in their own right, and the approval of new private universities. Coincidentally, the economy almost immediately collapsed, rebounding from the mid-80s. By 1990, with the military government ceding power, things were looking better, although at the last moment, the military government passed legislation, LOSE, to protect market mechanisms like fees and private governance. Privately controlled universities had started to grow. In 1999, we have the World Bank money and Mesesub, then the state-backed loans, universally available, and the renovated accreditation system. Since 2011, in fact, a little earlier, but peaking in 2011, there were big student protests, and protests of various kinds have continued ever since. One of the responses was gratuidad. There is an interesting English language account from, I think, 2017 by Andres Bernasconi for HEPI, I believe, in the UK, narrating how the initial resources for gratuidad were cobbled together from whatever institutional and state resources available under enormous political pressure. Since then, as the policy has brought in more students, it's now become a huge unfunded liability. So the synopsis is, Chilean development has alternated between different kinds of freedom and different kinds of regulation, often depending on opportunities. Any democratization with touches of populism has occurred in creative tension with economic market-based thinking. At the moment, no one is sure which way to lean. We can see that Chilean higher education has developed, but it has developed a bit like the memes that the youth enjoys, taking unpredictable stochastic turns. We can use the frequency of words appearing in bodies of text over time to trace the evolving currency of terms like development. This is a typical Google Ngram. Development rises out of the Enlightenment in French. Velop, the velop element of the word, seems to come from Gaulish, the Celtic language of which Breton is a surviving remnant. We don't know what velop meant. It could mean wrapped or rolled up, gestating, covered, stalled, waiting to be revealed. In any case, in English too, development has come to mean becoming more like oneself or cultivating something more the way we want it. It's quite organic and therefore really useful for explaining natural and social phenomena. In English, like in French, development booms after World War II. The peak comes in 1980, but immediately falls off in English. I think now we really take 1980 as an axial point in time. For a while, we had thought that history had ended in 1989, 1990, but we've since become interested again in the rise of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and retrospectively Deng Xiaoping. People often get excited about the parallels with Chile's attempts to install market-friendly policies under military government in the late 70s and early 80s. But in reality, Chile's economy and public policies battled through the 80s and dynamic coherence only emerged well into the 90s. In the UK, development may be making something of a comeback, I see. Late last year, the patch of the Foreign Secretary was changed to the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Cynics might say that this development means trying to place foreign aid more enterprisingly, as of course China has done so well recently. While part of the charm of development is its unclear origins, during the 19th century, of course, the German language and German thinking were extremely important. Now, German is a very explicit language, and its word for development, Entwicklung, very clearly means unwrapping fibers from a distaff onto a spindle. German folk culture, of course, is very interested in spindles. So this is a very clear metaphor for all the Hegelian dialectic and industrialization with automated mills and biological observation and pioneering social science that emerged from the German-speaking lands. Entwicklung shows a bumpier but similar trajectory to development in English. Now, coming to Spanish, we really have a case of looking for a word that fits a concept whose time has come and is being used in other languages. The Spanish word that won out from nowhere is desarrollo, which literally means wheel out or unroll or roll out. This image is not really organic, it's not even spinning, it's sort of all preconceived. As we've seen this year, vaccine development and vaccine rollout are two separate things. We now use the English expression rollout in Spanish for the logistics and politics of vaccines. So desarrollo suggests rolling out a judicious plan. The frequency of desarrollo rises like its equivalents in other languages, and then you will notice that in 1960 it becomes top jargon. In 1960, of course, appeared an Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development with Franco's Spain as a founding member. Chile has been devoted enough to development such that it has been a member of the OECD since the beginning of last decade. Chile actually has an Universidad de Desarrollo, University of Development, which in English might sound like a center of sustainable community-based basket weaving with Prince Charles as patron, But on the contrary, this Universidad de Desarrollo is associated with one of Chile's conservative political movements. It's very, very serious about its capitalistic development. The funniest name for a university in Chile is not Universidad de Desarrollo, however. It is Universidad de las Americas, University of the Americas, which of course recalls the School of the Americas, where the US has historically trained Latin American military officers in case they prove useful. Just to put a plug in, some Chileans, and I think a Mexican researcher, are soon presenting in this webinar series on decolonizing Latin American universities, and Universidad de las Americas would be one of many places to start. It belonged to the famous Laureate chain until its recent sale. Anyway, now I'm going to revisit some of José's graphs in light of the evolving notion of development. The development is meme-like in the sense that it does roll on, but rarely in public policy is a plan in evidence for long. Now, when we look at the size of the student body, of course, it has since dipped a little with protests and Corona. We are also in a demographic hole, both in terms of numbers finishing school and of working older adults who still need a degree, credential, or want an education. Chile is now experiencing rapid immigration, preponderantly from other parts of Latin America. In the medium term, that is a possible source of enrollment growth. Chile's gratuidad comes on the back of soaring demand-oriented funding, a kind of state bounty on getting more students. In Chilean public policy, human capital theory has long been a big part of development. A lot of programs explicitly call actual people human capital. When students have been sold the prospect of what are increasingly debased professional credentials as the reason for coming to university, it brings into question the quality of human capital yielded from such ostensible enrollment growth. To extend the human capital metaphor, this low credibility credentialism looks like a case of human inflation. When we look at the public monies coming in, especially the orange student aid band, now largely gratuidad, you might ask why the state and successive governments of different marks seem intent on going to the wall for higher education. And one hypothesis is this. Here we have a typical Hispanic pre-Columbian religious procession, a combination of the two. There's not too much of that in Chile. It's considered a bit tropical. Here we have protests. In the middle, the Valparaíso feminist group Las Tesis, who have a song linking critique, quite academic critique, of patriarchal institutions with the terrible prevalence of gender violence and intimidation that, of course, has been big in the news in the UK over the last few weeks, I've noticed. Of course, this is a theme that's resonant all around the world, but it's particularly terrible in Latin America. And on the right, we have a more masculine protest. These guys are angry with the state and the political class, and they formed a fixation with this statue, which is the statue of a general who actually stopped Santiago being sacked at the end of the Civil War of 1891. Many Chileans are very good at performing irony. They're not necessarily so good at understanding it, but these protests brought the country to a halt at the end of 2019. They certainly make the Rhodes Must Fall crew look genteel, don't they? Now, what these events have in common is a sensation of piety, of being members of something noble, like education, but in a more spontaneous way. This is civil religion. Now, it is hard to find public money to put towards higher education, certainly more public money, but as yet, there's still a lot of belief and aspiration in play. And compared to, say, investing in the compulsory levels of schooling, such that the society be better prepared overall and higher education could start on a firmer base, higher education is relatively cheap. Gratuidad is ultimately a religious word. It is literally a state of grace, a gift In this case, a sequestered and targeted state gift economy in the midst of market forces. Higher education may indeed be one way of the state gaining some purchase on civil religion. To end, I just wanted to relate a story of an interaction I had with a group of younger Chileans aged well under 30. And one of the young people was trying to explain to me what a meme was. Me being not only very didactic, but also hip with the kids. Of course, I wanted to deepen this exchange. So I said to them, you know, in the 70s, there was this evolutionary biologist in England, Richard Dawkins, and meme is his play on words to describe how ideas can pass down through time like genes. So a meme is like a gene involving memory and mimesis, and mem, which is French for self. And the young Chilean, he stopped me right there. No, he said, a meme is a picture on your phone with funny words. And if it moves, it's a GIF. So when we're talking about functional literacy and numeracy and critical thinking, learning outcomes, basic skills, we really have no idea what younger and emerging generations, how they think, what they're thinking about, why, and across different societies, comparing these things may be particularly difficult. And on that rousing note, I will pass you on to Elisabeth Simbürger. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Pete and Jose. My role as a sociologist of knowledge is to provide you with a slightly different spin that may complement Jose's as well as Pete's perspective on Chilean higher education. Particularly focusing on the concept of development that Pete as well as Jose were elaborating on, but looking at development from an epistemological point of view, looking at development in terms of possible paradigm shifts, thinking of Kuhn's famous book, The Social Structure of Scientific Revolutions. As both of my colleagues developed from the forceful implementation of neoliberalism by the dictatorship from 1973 until 1990 onwards, we can speak about a paradigm of university development that was driven by a dictatorship and continued in post-dictatorial times or post-democracy, democratic times that followed from 1990 onwards, which basically meant a perpetuation of neoliberal measures, as you could see in the different steps on the slides of Pete and Jose. Yet, my argument is that, and I think that's the real paradigm shift for those of you to understand who are maybe not so familiar with Chilean politics, is that from the point of view that university life can never be understood as an extra social activity. It is being inextricably linked with society as such, and being an expression of the worldviews of the current perspectives, social perspectives in a society. It is therefore that we need to shed some more light on social and political life in Chile. And my argument is that the real paradigm shift occurred from 2011 onwards with the Chilean students movement and the rupture of the beginning of the rupture of what can be called a totally naturalized neoliberal system. As a consequence of that, bottom-up movement, a free access to university reform, free tuition fee reform, was implemented in 2016, which is an ongoing process. As another example of a paradigm shift in terms of development, in terms of a bottom-up process, I would like to mention the feminist students movement in universities in 2018, which was literally groundbreaking. For several months, all universities in Chile were occupied by feminist students in an aftermath of demanding equal opportunity and gender units in universities, so as to prohibit and to persecute sexual harassment, but also to put some more focus on feminist knowledge in universities. So again, the interesting aspect about that is that from 2018-19 onwards, nowadays all university count with gender and equal opportunity units as a result of this movement, which is not universities as such, but it is thanks to feminist students and students in general that these developments were pushed. Finally, as you may well know from the press, since October 2019, Chile has experienced a social uprising, which is still ongoing, and as a consequence of that, we will now start the process of writing new constitutions with constituents, simple citizens, as well as party politicians. It's a complex story that I will not really be able to delve into, but basically people are asking for dignity. So as a final argument, I'd like to say, rather than these days just looking to Chile as an example for universities, as a neoliberal experiment, as a neoliberal lab, these days it may also be worth looking to Chile as an example for social protest, social transformation that may well take its origins, looking at the social students movement from 2011 and the feminist students movement from 2008 in a bottom-up process. Thank you.
Thanks, Elisabeth. Thanks, Pete, and thanks, Jose. It's a great pleasure to hear the discussion about Chile and to share it with you. I mean, as a young student activist, the great causes that we were concerned about were Vietnam, then Palestine, and then Chile, and what happened in 1973. And you know, when the great Salvador Allende fell, and the professor who was relevant to society lost his office and in the terrible coup. And Chile has always, I think, been a place where the role of the state is really contested. And perhaps the role of the state is a central question for us in higher education studies, because, you know, universities and other higher education institutions and science and research are so embedded in states everywhere, whether it's recognized as such or not. And in many countries, of course, it's made very explicit. But in Chile, the state is not a problem which calls up a consensus. There's this tremendous ambivalence about the state, because the state has been through this great, you know, opposite cycles of repression and liberation and democratization. You referred, Pete, I think, to, you know, the alternation between, you know, neoliberal marketization and the politics of democratization and the kind of social and cultural agenda, and how that alternation shapes the sector. And I think that's true worldwide, but there's something special about the problem in Chile, I think, which is of interest to everyone, precisely because there's no consensus on the role of the state. What I was going to ask you, three of you really, because Jose knows about this as well, quite well, is what's the attitude of the officials, the state officials who work on higher education policy and its implementation? How do they see the role of government? I mean, do they see the role of government in the terms of a British Treasury or neoliberal agenda where economics should rule government? Or do they see the role of higher education in terms of democratizing and a social reform and a cultural diverse agenda, you know, that we would all support? I mean, you know, what's the understanding about the role of government in the government itself?
Well, in the Ministry of Education, the higher education section of the Ministry of Education is a fairly minor affair. The current Minister of Education was actually elevated from the higher education portfolio a couple of years ago, and he's a lawyer with no real experience in neither in higher education nor in schooling, but he's extremely good at putting out spot fires. And his performance has actually been very good on a technical basis, not allowing much ideological discussion of education to come in during the last year and a half or so. But in terms of engaging in the issues, as far as we can tell, there is no higher education, or for that matter, schooling policy in place at the government level. José is working with the government, and we'll be able to comment in some depth there.
Thank you for that introduction, Pete. Basically, I could say that over the last 30 years, government official has been quite into adhering and selling the World Bank idea of what higher education should look like, and its role on reforming higher education as such. So the idea of modernizing higher education and expanding higher education under those grounds has been over and over and over in the discourse of public officials, like a little bit of a mantra, has been very, very, very important. But since the time which Elisabeth was referring to, that things change. And the reform we have already into implementation is a reform that trying to address the concerns and issues she described, and also the problems of debt. Student debt is a very important matter at the moment, and people don't know how to address that properly. So they bring us this reform to pretty much pacify the conversation, because it was very active as the process of 2011 started and on. But the content of reform is not really there. They try to make small adjustments and provide a comprehensive framework without any idea where to go through. So we have a recent change in the discourse of policy officials and government officials, which is really different from the past. Now, they don't have a discourse to sell. They just into the procedural details, trying to tell us how they're going to implement things, but not going really where to go. There is a lack of new policy narrative available. And it's quite clear that the government is concentrated in how they move the legislative mandate from one step to the next one, but don't know why and how. And this is quite clear because we're being experiencing a lot of troubles with the new gratuidad scheme, which demands the government to set limits for public contribution to higher education based on per head contribution, per student contribution, and a lot of discussion on that ground. A lot of problems thinking about what accreditation should be in this new context of massive higher education. We are very, very struggled times trying to define the criteria to apply for institutional accreditation procedures. And all that is, I reckon, is a symptom of, okay, we are trying to get things calm a little bit. We're trying to show people that we are moving somehow in some direction, but it's not a clear sense of where to move. And that is very important, Simon, because as you said, the government and the state was a really part of the conversation. But when the government and the state have no sense of where to go, the idea of cooperation and coordination decrease over time. And institutions are somehow paralyzed, waiting to see what the government is going to do next, but having very little understanding for where to go and how to prepare for the future. This year only, enrollment figures, we just ended the enrollment season a month ago, and are even worse than 2020. So the situation is getting dire, and we need to start a conversation about how to move forward, but it seems that nobody's taking the first step. So we are in this sort of policy paralysis in which we have to come up with some sort of answer, and soon.
I mean, nations do solve this problem from time to time. They do develop a new agenda, a new policy, a new system organizing and institutional cultural framework, which allows them to reset or remake a higher education system and bring it to a new level of activity. I hesitate to say the word performance because of all the various meanings attached to that word. But it does happen. And most of the time it doesn't happen when ministers announce new policies, but sometimes it does. And you can point to several interesting examples across the world in different kinds of political system. But there seem to be a couple of things which are necessary. One is to have a coherent plan. The second one is to have a pivotal point where reorganisation can occur, and that usually means a minister. But it also means a minister who's able to get purchase on the sector, who's able to get implementation happening. And the other one is resources. You usually need a new parcel of resources to accompany a successful transformation agenda. I mean, you try and do it with no money, like Ireland's trying to do with putting its technological universities together. It doesn't work, or it takes a very, very long time to happen. So are those conditions within reach, the strong ministry, the effective implementation, and the parcel of resources? Because if those conditions aren't in reach, I suspect things just go on being unsolved as now.
If I could just comment, Simon, one of the interesting things that's happened in Chile over the last 10 years is that the connection between the student political movement and mainstream politics has ruptured. There was an attempt to create a new sort of generational political movement, which is completely discredited now. And student politics aren't cool. As Elisabeth mentioned, the feminist movement, which of course has a lot of international momentum behind it, has been making considerable impact, and was somewhat during 2018, 2019. There were certainly plans to parlay that into a major movement, but it was cut off by the general social outburst of the end of 2019. One of the interesting things about the commentary about Latin American higher education in general is that a Chilean sociologist in the 70s did a study. He was in exile. He did a study on UNAM in Mexico and discussed the jousting between young aspiring politicians that happened in elite, still fairly elite even at that stage. There was probably 300,000 students at UNAM in the late 70s, but there was a sense of creating a kind of political leadership within the universities. Lomnitz is the name of that sociologist. And actually Burton Clark famously cited and used Lomnitz's research, which I think probably distorted somewhat the idea that, the Latin American universities are very vibrantly political and so on and so forth. We remember Mexico in the late 60s, and we remember all of this and all of that. But in any case, in current universal stage of higher education access, we're not seeing student leadership coming out of universities, mainstream student leadership coming out of universities. We're not seeing, apart from really on the right side of politics, we're not seeing talent coming into, we're certainly not seeing ideas about education coming into the political scene and the bureaucratic scene and so on. I think the feminist movement is an exception there, but apart from that, it's not looking good.
And I suppose the other condition that you need at the centre of government, you need a commitment to education reform as a primary objective. And, that only occurs some of the time and usually requires political leadership of the country to really understand and be, committed to this sector and science and so on as really key sectors. And that only happens a minority of the time in a minority of countries. We now have a call list, I'm pleased to say, so my extra improvisation won't be necessary anymore. We'll take Hongwei Gu first, followed by Stephen Darwin, Christina Cavallo, and Hector Rios. Hongwei.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. Chileans value education. They see it as the most important and surest path towards continued prosperity. Taking this into account, why is there an uneven disparity in terms of access for aspirants from different backgrounds and income groups in Chile? Thank you.
I can respond to that. I guess it's an issue that Carolina Guzman will elaborate on in detail in the next talk next week or whenever that is. But in general, I would say it has to do with the picture that Pete and Jose were showing, but we're not talking about the forgotten history of Chilean colonialism. And with that, the issue of race and racism within the country against its Aborigines, indigenous people, the Mapuche, and ongoing issues of classist segregation, which could not be resolved by the university reform, even though, like as Jose mentioned, certain inroads have been made, like in terms of numbers, but the type of institutions where students from poorer backgrounds are studying are commonly institutions that are on the lower end of prestige.
Also, as you say, you focused on racism. There are many countries that focus on racism and have issues with race. Do you think it's the problem that people think these people are inferior, so they are disadvantaged, or is it another reason for that?
Chile historically has a very strong discourse of there being one Chilean race with lots of different shades. The Chileans are a mestizo people. Very few Chileans don't have indigenous descent. And during the Republican period, a very important part of the organization of the society, so we're talking the last 200 years, really has the issue of race, at least in the the North American sense of there being different races and you can only be one at the same time, or you can be two, but then you're biracial. That sort of thing is not part of the Chilean tradition, but there is a very strong correlation between how light you are and how wealthy you are. There's a strong correlation between where your surname comes from. If your surname comes from Northern Europe or from the Basque country, you're much more likely to be wealthy, and so on and so forth. Actually, a Chilean anthropologist minted the phrase pigmentocracy, rule by the lack of pigment in your skin and your hair, which is sometimes used in English now. I think it's a nicer word than colorism. The problem is less pigment is more power. Alejandro Lipschutz, he was an immigrant from Lithuania or Latvia. So there is a sort of continuous concept of ethnicity that's not exactly, it's not race, it's the shade, it's a futuristic one. And in fact, in North America, some sociologists are starting to use the word pigmentocracy to describe discrimination. And it's obviously a huge problem. Ethnically shaded opportunity in Latin America is a huge problem, always has been. There used to be fantasies about racially pure groups, castes, but that hasn't really, Chile was always an isolated place. And
also, final issue is that's
Conway,
the Chilean.
no. Conway, I'm sorry, no follow-up. You've had 2 questions already. We've got other questioners. I did send you a message saying no more. Colleagues, what I'd like to do now is put a group of questions forward because we don't have a lot of time left, and we've got 3 excellent panelists who may want to say something before we close. So I'm going to invite the 4 people on our call list to each come in succession, and colleague speakers, don't respond until you've heard the 4 questions, please. Our first question then is from Stephen Darwin.
Thanks. Look, just quickly, on quite a different front, I was taken by that startling graph that Jose put up about demand and supply funding. And I wondered whether that distorts the policy framework that's developed around higher education in Chile, with a focus much more on policy around generating quantity as opposed to thinking about the quality of provision, and whether that distorted funding arrangement has had a distorted effect on policy creation as well.
Thanks, Stephen. Cristina Cavallo.
Thank you so much for all panelists. My name is Cristina Carvalho from Brazil, Universidad de Brasília. And my ask is for Professor José. Can you clarify regarding tendencies to for-profit higher education sector in Chile? What are the main corporate groups that operate in Chile? Thank you so much.
And Hector Rios has the third question.
Thank you so much to the panelists. I'm Hector, doing a PhD at UCL, but also from Chile. I'm doing research on free education policy. I was wondering your views about the future of the free education policy, considering first the fact that we are, after the uprising of 2019, we have rising demands on the role of state, as you mentioned already, but also we have a deficit with the recession of the pandemic. So much the demands around the role of the state will be affected in the current economic situation. So what is your views about the future of the free education policy in Chile?
Thank you for all the questions.
No, wait. Evandro Gogo Cristofiletti, please. Evandro.
Thank you for the lecture. And I have two questions actually, and feel free to answer one or two. And I would like to ask about the conflicts between the students and the policymakers related to higher education and recent in Chile. And how do you see the Chilean higher education within the Latin American context? Because here in Brazil we have a trend to, and the government are trying to charging monthly fees and attracting private fundings. So how do you see this Chile in the Latin America context? That's it.
Thanks, Evandro. So colleagues, you have the 4 questions. And I'll take you in the reverse order. So we'll get the first reply will be from Elisabeth. All right.
Yeah, just briefly commenting on Hector's questions, question or comment, as he rightly says, I think a lot of the future of Chile's universities depends on how the issue of the state is going to be resolved in what's the constituency process, the process of writing the new constitution. And with that, issues such as corruption on a general level in society, as well as in universities, will have to be addressed. But it really depends on what is happening in the short and long run.
Thanks, Elisabeth. Pete, number of themes there.
Are you there?
Yes, we're there, waiting for you.
I'm just waiting for Pete. I cannot see.
Unmute. Yeah, sorry, I'll go in reverse order as well. I didn't unmute myself. Now, I'll just comment on Evandro. Now, both in terms of the conflict between students and policymakers and in terms of Chile's position in Latin America, the students at the moment, I think apathy seems to be a big general problem over the last year and a half. The big protests at the end of 2019 weren't student protests. It was everybody. It was everybody fed up with things. And we call that uprising at the end of 2019, of course, following Argentina in 2001. We call it the social splintering, And like in a lot of places in the world, we've come to use the word social. This would make the French sociologist Bruno Latour smile. We use social to mean the good things that aren't coming out in the state. The social is the things that the market isn't looking after and state policy isn't looking after. The social is always right. One of the things, and this touches on Hector's comments as well, Chilean society itself has problems. The social isn't an infinite positive source of wonderful things. Chileans have to work out how they're going to raise a tax base. Most Chileans don't pay any income tax. They're put through the process of filling out tax returns, but they don't pay any. They don't realize they don't pay any income tax. They pay consumption tax. Some of the tax is from mining royalties. And Chileans, if they want the state to be bigger, the state is a kind of puffed up state that seems to do a lot of things, and it's an important fictional person in the lives of people. If people want the state to be able to provide more things, then Chileans have to trust one another to establish a financial basis to run a state to do more of these wholesome things that everyone expects from the social. And I haven't seen it happen yet.
Okay. Jose.
Okay. I will start with a brief comment to Howey, the conversation he started. Chile is a very stratified society. So the school system is stratified, as the university system is stratified as well. So the poor kids are going to vocational tertiary education, and the ones who go to the university are going to the lowest esteem institutions, as tend to happen in many different countries. The difference in Chile, though, is that it tends to be quite naturalized. Nobody asks much questions about that. And the idea of social mobility and those sort of conversations are very marginal at the aggregate level. Coming back to Stephen's question, I could say that what the Chilean government started in 1998 was the idea of getting expansion and modernization at the same time. And of course, the expansion unwrapped quite quickly, but the modernization phase didn't work quite well. The policy infrastructure available for that, accreditation mainly, and the funding system available didn't work as expected. And so they are trying to get up with the idea now how we can deal with these issues again. And one of the fundamental problems they are facing is probably that the idea of modernization they come up with was an idea in which you have to modernize the executive leadership in universities. Instead of looking at the aggregate function of the universities, academics are mainly not involved in that. So an idea that the quality issue and how to increase quality in Chilean higher education and in Chilean universities is a conversation we have to take now seriously and just starting for real. And this discussion about the standard for accreditation as an open policy conversation is something we have to come up with some results in the future. Coming back to the for-profits, Professor Cristina. In Chile, for-profit higher education is only allowed in the vocational sector, not in universities. Has been forbidden since ever. But as I said in my part of the talk, there is a lot of de facto for-profit. Now we have a new regulatory agency looking at that, which is called a Superintendencia de Educación Superior, Higher Education Superintendency. And we can see some results coming out of that. For example, as Pete mentioned in his talk, Laureate, which was a prominent leader in Chilean higher education, left the country like 6 months ago. So they control something like 15% of the whole enrollment of the nation. And now they're out of the country. And other Chileans are taking on that. So it's changing, and we can see probably less room available in the future to cover the idea of for-profit. Well, and of course, this idea of for-profit is about how you distribute the funding the state provides on higher education in the end, because the business model for for-profit is taking subsidies out of the government to allow people to get into universities, right? So this substitution for this sort of student loan scheme towards gratuidad is a change we're facing now. And the basic problem in that, as the question suggests, is that how sustainable is gratuidad? It's only meant to grow, but the only way to grow is just lowering the per student funding available. So in the end, we're going to have an important trouble in there. And if you add on top of that the ongoing economic crisis, it seems that we have to review what we've been doing in this area recently. Problem is, there is no political support for that. The overall population want to keep gratuidad expanded as such, but it's kind of hard, and we cannot have the people from the tertiary engage into the conversation fully. So it's an ongoing process. We have to see how the whole thing is going to end. And what about policy making and students? Well, students are now policymakers. the people who lead the roles of 2011 now in the parliament are negotiating laws in relation to this. But as Pete mentioned somehow, the entire idea of higher education policy being important, an important issue in the parliament, is kind of gone. There are other issues that are way more urgent now. The constitutional discussion, and Elisabeth mentioned, is going to be a very relevant part of that. But what's going to happen to higher education? Probably have to wait and see a little bit to have a proper picture of what's going on the ground. So what we're showing now is that we have gone through all this trajectory, all these things happen to higher education. We are in the point in which we have to define what we're going to do next, but we don't know yet. So how we're going to improvise a solution, how we're going to come up to terms in order to align the sector with a sense of that we can come together with something that is meaningful, is something that has to be seen in the years to come. But what has been missed in the past, and probably is going to be very important in the future, is the idea that higher education voices need to be leading the conversation, and hasn't been the case in the years past. So we have to see if the sector provides enough leadership to allow the reform to happen and provide a sense of direction that is really important for the years to come. That's it, Simon.
Well, thank you, Jose, and thank you, Elisabeth and Pete. A lot of issues on the table. There's something about the webinar format. We only have an hour, a tiny bit more, as you usually steal another 5-10 minutes. But it's the result is that you get many unresolved conversations. It doesn't make for neat narratives, you know, with nice endings and resolutions, but it's probably more like real life, isn't it? With things not clear, and all in the process of becoming, and we hope becoming clearer over time. But I really like the way you approach this, and the way the three of you had such a different style and different folky and different language and different images, and yet it all gelled in a really nice way. So thank you for your unity and diversity. And thank you for bringing us to Chile, because it's really interesting and important country, and we want to be back there again in future. So we would like to have you back with us again in future. Not necessarily just because of these major new developments, but also because you have a new thought about what is going on as well. Our next webinar, colleagues, is on Tuesday next week, and we're again in Latin America, and we've referred to that webinar already several times, so it's already affecting our consciousness. Decolonizing the Latin American universities, and we have Alma Maldonado from Mexico, Carolina Guzman Venezuela from Chile, and to keep those two rascals honest, we have Gunther Dietz. The people I know I call rascals, you see, and the people I don't know so well. I hope that the rascals will be kept in order. But our three speakers next Tuesday will be terrific speakers, really challenging and really interesting. And look, decolonization is an issue right across the world. All the countries that were affected by colonization and all the countries that were colonizers are going through this discussion properly now, I think, perhaps for the first time. So we'll all be listening and engaged, and we want to have the three of you in that participant audience then and asking questions. Hope we'll see you back then. And all the rest of our colleagues, thank you very much for participating. Come back again next Tuesday. Bye for now.
Thank you.